the only accurate survival guide to World War III. Our civilization's final arms control agreement is due to expire in a fortnight. Is it our last lifeline? By me, Matt Alford. When I was 10 years old, I had an alphabetical survival encyclopedia. Under N was nuclear war. I'd already read a whole chapter about this in the SAS Survival Handbook by John Lofty Wiseman, whose advice on building a shelter and filling my bathtub with water was absolutely wizard. I turned excitedly to the entry. Nuclear war had been on my mind quite a bit since Dad had told me, rather carelessly, that if it does happen, everyone on Earth will freeze to death. 80s dads didn't mince words. Sorry, Lofty, but I had no practical skills to build a shelter, so in the event of war, I had determined to hide in the airing cupboard. Unfortunately, this new survival book's entry only served to deepen my existential angst. Stark in black and white, set against a blank page, it simply read, "I'm not going to tell you how to survive a nuclear war, because if I do, you might just go ahead and have one." 30 years on, and our whole civilization is banging on as though we can have a third world war and then all go home for tea. In adulthood, as I developed my knowledge of international relations, I learned that modelling for nuclear use does indeed point to a chain reaction liable to destroy us all. The Survival Almanac, and sadly my dad too, was right. Here's a quick primer. The Global Catastrophic Risk Institute, the GCRI, has developed probabilistic models of nuclear war that examine multiple escalation pathways, including deliberate first use, inadvertent escalation, and crisis instability, explicitly embedding psychology, misperception, and stress. The models consistently show that once nuclear weapons are used, the risk of escalation becomes increasingly uncontrollable. Nor should anyone feel remotely safe if someone just uses a teeny tiny nuclear weapon. The analytical models show that the distinction between low yield and high yield weapons blurs quickly in crisis dynamics, making reciprocal use and escalation likely rather than unlikely. In the US National Command war game called Proud Prophet, planners ran scenarios including low yield strikes intended to be limited. Instead of remaining limited, the scenario spiraled rapidly into massive nuclear exchange on both sides, destroying European cities. NATO players attempting to signal restraint ended up disbelieved by their Soviet counterparts, who interpreted attempts at de-escalation, limited strikes, as existential threats. Rand Corporation analyses of escalation dynamics consistently reach similar conclusions. Once nuclear use occurs, signaling becomes unreliable, misperception dominates, and the probability of further escalation increases rather than stabilizes. The Arms Control Center summarizes what US and Allied security planning documents tend to imply rather than state outright. Quote, "The first use of nuclear weapons against a nuclear-armed state will almost certainly result in nuclear retaliation and escalation." In short, leaders will sometimes feel safer authorizing nuclear use from hardened bunkers than negotiating under visible political pressure above ground. Scholars have repeatedly examined the idea that nuclear use could function as a coercive tool to de-escalate conflict, a doctrine often labeled as escalate to de-escalate. While most commonly associated with Russian strategy, analogous ideas recur in Western debates under headings like limited nuclear options and escalation control. The largest survey of elite-level wargames and crisis simulations by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists found that only 5 out of 55 attempts at escalation for coercion succeeded, a success rate of under 10%. Military participants were at least 4 times more likely than civilian counterparts to choose escalation. And beyond war games and structured models, even dry old game theory, without factoring in human emotions, shows why escalation is hard to contain. Rational actor models don't guarantee peace. They show that once nuclear use happens, it changes the payoff landscape and becomes a statistically higher probability for escalation than containment. British television used to understand this too. From the 1990s onwards, BBC and Channel 4 documentaries ran several wargaming scenarios, including the India-Pakistan crises, that almost always ended the same way: escalation that nobody could stop. More recently, Sky News wargamed a scenario between Britain and Russia, but rather ridiculously, it drifted into a repetitive editorial for radically increasing British rearmament. While the risks of nuclear use are often waved away, it is a fact that in 2022, the head of the CIA himself met his Russian counterpart and returned home estimating a genuine risk that Putin would use a nuke in Ukraine. The word in the White House was that this would be around a 50% chance if Ukraine tried to retake Crimea. Concerned about the standoff, the worst standoff since the Cuban Missile Crisis, a pre-dementia President Biden mused out loud, "I don't think there's any such thing as the ability to easily use a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon." There is still breathtaking denial online about these simple assessments. The START Treaty is set to expire on February the 5th, 2026. It is the last remaining arms control agreement between the US and Russia. Are we really so mad as to enter a period when two great adversaries explicitly refuse to have any formal constraints whatsoever on nuclear deployment and manufacture? Meanwhile, President Trump's much-billed attack on the Iranian leadership, the second biggest country in the region, has likely only been delayed a week or so while he redeploys the USS Abraham Lincoln, no doubt hoping it will be enough to prevent overwhelming retaliation on Israel. But what if he's wrong? We cannot get away with even one nuclear weapon being used. There is not enough room in my airing cupboard for the rest of you.